All right, we begin. Everybody who comes in after this is late. I just wanted to say that. Anyway, so we're going to talk about React Native code reuse because that's what's on the board. And my name is Greenwald. That's what it says. I work at a company called Wix, blah, blah, blah. Now that we got that out of the way, let's start. Survey. Everybody here, developers? Hands? All right. Impressive. How many people here have used React Native? Okay, nice chunk of you. And people here that never used it but are interested in hearing about how it works or have suspicions or things like that? Yeah, all right. The suspicions got people to raise their hands. So, and that's legitimate. The topic of this talk is not about those suspicions, but I'd be happy to discuss them. A little bit I'll mention during and if Q&A afterwards, or I'll be here the whole conference. You can talk to me about all those concerns you have about whether React Native is even a good fit for your project. But assuming that you have used React Native or you are using your React Native for your project, you've been sold a promise, all right? And the promise was put forth by a blog post that originally basically unveiled React Native from Facebook. And they said, talking about React Native and the way they designed this thing, that the approach that they took yielded about 85% code reuse. Now, 85% is a pretty high number. They're talking about between Android and iOS, obviously. And I think I don't need to convince you that reusing code is a good thing. It's one of the main attractions of React Native. Does anybody not know who Lemony Snicket is? Snicket? You don't know who Lemony Snicket is? You do. Oh, only one person does know. Y'all need to read more. The real question you probably have now is it true? Can you actually do that? Maybe Facebook can do that because they wrote the framework. So if you write the framework for your own needs, you can probably get a whole lot out of it. But the question is, can us mere mortals, regular human beings, come to React Native and actually get that? And the answer in my experience, or our experience at Wix, is yes, you can. In fact, I don't have numbers. I didn't measure it. But my gut feeling is that we have more than 85% code reuse in our code base, at least in certain parts of the code base. And we're going to talk about what that means. But in certain parts of the code base, we're certainly doing better than 85%. So I don't think that they're over-promising anything. But of course, there are caveats. It's not a free lunch. And that's the topic of this talk. How do you make it so that you can really get those promised numbers? And what do you have to do so that you can maximize just how much code reuse you can get out of your code base? Because if you don't try, you probably won't get 85%. And if you royally screw it up, you'll probably do a whole lot worse. Well, let's take a step back and think about what it means, code reuse. Because usually when we talk about code reuse, we're talking about Android and iOS in this context. We come to React Native because we need an Android app, we need an iOS app, and we're like, oh my gosh, I don't want to do this whole thing twice. What can I do? So for the last decade or so, we've had all kinds of promises of cross-platform development solutions. Some were better, some were worse, most were worse. Now, there are other kinds of code reuse that might attract you to React Native, such as reusing code with your web app. If you have an existing web app, like we did, and many solutions, if you're not building a mobile-only solution, you probably have a lot of shared logic between what happens in your mobile app and happens in your web app. I was talking to somebody today about Trello. Trello is a great example of this. I mean, it's basically the same functionality in a different format between the web and desktop. I'm sorry, between the web and mobile. So you might want to reuse a lot of code there, and people often ask me about that. How can I even reuse code between my apps? And of course, you might want to reuse code between multiple projects. You might have more than one React Native project, more than one mobile app, and you want to reuse code between those things. And that's also a valid concern and something that needs to be taken into consideration. Let's start with the most popular and most traditional kind of reuse in React Native, Android and iOS. I have two apps. Of course, Windows Phone. Anybody here support Windows Phone in their company? Two. Okay, so Windows Phone, I really wish they did better, honestly. And I'm not blaming Microsoft. I really wish that there was a viable alternative to the duopoly we have now. And it is my hope that React Native will help us get there because, you know, maybe you're not willing to, most people, it seems, are not willing to invest a whole lot of developer effort into developing for such a small user base, but if all you have to do is a little bit, if you're getting 85% reuse anyway, and you only have to do that 15% to make it work for Windows, maybe people will start using Windows again. Make Windows again. Yeah, great again. Whatever the thing is these days. Never thought I'd have to say that. But anyway, between Android and iOS, how do you do it? Well, the question really is not what can you share, but what can't you share, right? Your apps, especially in a React Native app, right? You start with your JavaScript, all your code's shared. At least all your JavaScript code is shared, right? By default, the code you write works for both Android and iOS on the JavaScript side of the bridge. So what the discussion in React Native of cross-platform is often not really about how you get code to be cross-platform, but how you get code to be platform specific. I want to write some code that only will be relevant for Android or only relevant for iOS. Maybe the UI is different. Maybe I need to show or have different features, etc. There are two ways to do this in React Native. The first one is the platform module. You can import the platform module. It looks just like this. You use it with platform.os. The OS is a string variable. It's either iOS or Android, and I guess whatever operating system that they do or will support in the future. And here I'm using it with a conditional, but you can put it anywhere in your code. You can say if the platform is this, I want to do that. If the platform is this, I want to do that, and etc. All right, this is one simple way to split your code for Android and iOS. There's another way, which is the file name suffixes magic that React Native gives you. What does this mean? Well, here's a screenshot of the file directory with WebStorm telling me that I spelled meme builder wrong. Thank you, WebStorm. But what's interesting here is the input box. I have an input box, which is used in some form somewhere in my meme builder. And the input box is different styling for Android and iOS. And the reason for this is because I want it to look like it's part of the native platform. So it has different styling. So I create an inputbox.android.js and inputbox.ios.js. These are two separate components, completely separate, but they have the same name. And when I import them to some other file, I just import inputbox. Now that file doesn't actually exist. There's no file inputbox.js. There's only inputbox Android or inputbox iOS. But at build time, the React Native packager understands I'm building for iOS, I'm building for Android, picks the relevant files, and compiles them without the suffix. So essentially what you get is, when you package your React Native app, if you're packaging for Android, you get all the files except those with .ios, and for iOS, you get all the files except those with .android. So anything that doesn't have a file name suffix, anything that doesn't have a platform suffix is for both. Anything that does have a platform suffix is only for that platform. Okay, what's the difference? Why would I use one? Why would I use the other? Well, the platform module is evaluated at runtime. So in my code, in that example I showed you, in my code, every single time that component code is run, it's in a render, let's say, every time that component is rendered, it has to check, am I in Android, am I in iOS? How expensive is this? I don't know, probably not very expensive. Probably trivially expensive. It's not a serious concern, but it is ugly. Because the truth of the matter is there isn't a conditional here. It's not like sometimes this component renders this and sometimes this component renders this. No. At runtime, there's just one component and it always renders the same thing. So semantically, it's incorrect to put a conditional there. Right? It would be much nicer and cleaner to use file name suffixes. What's the cost of file name suffixes? It's confusing. You now have two files named inputbox. Right? When you search in your IDE, you're a little bit confused, especially if I were to go back to this file and let's say if my IDE is not super React Native aware and I command click on it or whatever it is, it'll say that file doesn't exist. That's kind of annoying. And then when you make a change to one of these components and that change is supposed to be relevant for both, you have to remember to do it in both. And if you think you won't forget, you're lying to yourself. You will. So in general, what do we use? In general, we recommend file name suffixes because it's a cleaner, more proper solution. But for one-offs, especially sometimes in styling, when the font size is going to be a little bit different, then we might just do a ternary operator on the platform, and either it's 14 or it's 16. It's cheating, but it works. These two options are available to you, and you can use them as desired. But I want to mention one other thing that comes up when people hear about this. They often say, okay, you know what? The file name suffixes is better. I like it. It's clean. So what am I going to do? This is great. This is JavaScript. It's React. And now, especially if you're in the modern world, in JavaScript you can do inheritance easily, right? You have classes. You could always do kind of inheritance. But now it looks nicer and it feels better. So this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to make input box. That's going to have all the common functionality. And then I'm going to inherit from it input box Android and box iOS. And I'll implement those in my respective components. And of course, I'll only override the pieces that are specific for one platform or the other. It sounds like a good idea. But remember when I told you that it was a pain to have 2 files? Well, now you have 3. And you're never going to be able to find the code that you're looking for. I end up so much in this situation because we used to do this a lot. We thought it was very elegant and clever. And we're like, oh yeah, we'll just have all this inheritance tree and I don't know. You know who does it especially? The Android developers that then come to React Native because they love object-oriented programming. Like, oh, I think we need a class factory manager service for this. You don't do that. Composition is easier here, okay? If you have some component, a form, that's generic. So don't make a form and then inherit the Android form and the iOS form that only overrides the input box. Make a form that's generic, and it will import input box, and input box will be implemented twice. So composition, better than inheritance. You break your components into little pieces. Oftentimes, your big wrapper components are shared between Android and iOS, and it's the individual pieces that are different. In fact, maybe just the text fields or things like that, but the whole structure is the same, more or less. So I make that recommendation. I urge you not to make the mistake I made in the beginning. Favor simplicity. But the bottom line here is this. If you want to share code between Android and iOS, if you want to maximize how much code you can share, the architecture that you're using your app matters. The architecture that you decide to use from the beginning matters. Because if you make mistakes, it will be harder to share code later. And it will take a lot of refactoring to do it. What do I mean? First of all, keep your logic out of your views. Those of us who are web developers, and let's say did Angular before React, we would probably kill somebody before we put JavaScript inside a template view. Because you shouldn't put logic in your views. Then React says, no, what do you mean? It's all just JavaScript, right? Like JSX is JavaScript, so you can just throw all kinds of things in there. Yeah, in theory you can. Everything's just JavaScript. I mean, everything's, right? It's just bytes. You can say just about anything, but it doesn't make it just. It's still a view, and you still should have single responsibility principle, and you should still follow software engineering best practices, still separate your concerns, and still separate your logic from your views, because most of the time your logic is going to be cross-platform and your views won't be. And every time you pollute a view with some logic, even in lifecycle functions, which you can't always get away from, but every time you do it, you have another thing that is a little bit harder to test, topic of a different talk, but a lot harder to test, sorry. In React Native, component testing is difficult. And a lot harder to keep clean and reusable. So follow the single responsibility principle. Every function should do just one thing. Pull your logic out into pure JavaScript functions. Those things can be reusable. You might not, some functions, some logic might only be relevant to one platform or another, and so it won't be reused. But because everything is just pure little functions, you can then pick and choose in your views what to use, maximizing how much you can reuse. Number 2, this is a follow of that. Use some kind of pattern. Okay, the presenter pattern is common to a lot of people. The dispatcher pattern is not, because I think I made up that term. but it's the opposite of the presenter pattern, okay? So oftentimes, before you put data on a screen, you want to organize it, format it, figure out what you're gonna put where, and use a presenter for that, and then you just slap it onto the screen, and that presenter is shared. Oftentimes before you take data off of a screen, because you're gonna send it to a server, you marshal it, you massage it, you clean it, you do things with it, you check it. Do that, and also, a lot of people, I've seen this happen over and over, people have a tendency to do that for some reason in an on-press event. They just, oh, it's a callback, I'll just put a bunch of junk in here. No, pull that out, put it in some function that does it, some service, dispatcher, whatever you call it, which allows you to have your logic cross-platform, and again, keep your views small and modular. This is a follow-up of the single responsibility principle, but specifically for views. Because, okay, fine, so I convinced you, you'll take all your logic, and you'll put it in pure JavaScript functions, and you'll test those easily, and you'll reuse them, and everything's good. But your view still looks like a big ball of mud. Because it's just a lot of, right, it's like, oh, it's JSX, which is basically XML, which is like HTML, so you can just have this big one file that has everything in it. And it looks like a good idea, and it's easy to read, actually, because you can see like the whole structure of your thing. But what happens when there's something all the way down the tree that needs to be different between iOS and Android? What you'll find is, if you make your components small enough, most of them are the same for Android and iOS. Take out every app that you have on your phone. Or if you have an Android and an iPhone, take out some common app, maybe Trello, maybe Airbnb, right? And okay, they might feel like totally different apps between Android and iOS. You might look at them and say, yeah, these are totally different UI, right? But then if you really break it up into little pieces, you might realize that, wait, actually it's about 90% the same. They just organize those 90% in different ways. They leave something out, the navigation's a little bit different, the header's a little bit different styling, but there's all the components, or almost all the components, can be reused. So you can build two views that look completely different, both looking completely native to their platforms, and reusing so much if each one of those little pieces is small, and those that are common are reusable. So break your thing into as many pieces as you can. It's fine if you have components that have just 2, 3, 4 lines of JSX in them. It's good even. Those things will become reusable. Do it. And then if you have an app that has the larger organization that's the same, but the little pieces are different, then that's even easier. You make 2 input boxes, but you lay out the form the same way. And the file name suffixes allow you to just import input box without really pretending. It's transparent. You're pretending that it doesn't matter. Okay, good. We reused a lot of code between our Android and iOS apps. I hope I convinced you that you can do it if you architect your app correctly. What about web apps? People ask me this a lot. They say, okay, fine, great, but I have a web app, and really the reason I'm attracted to React Native is I want to reuse as much of the web app as I can. And I know I can use some kind of web view, but I don't want it to look like crap, and I don't want it to feel even worse. And I know that I could just, have a mobile website, right? Which I do have, but what kind of user experience is that? But if I use React Native, can I reuse a lot of my React app? Possibly. Again, architecture matters. If you organize your code well, nicely, cleanly, then you should be able to reuse a good chunk of it, but not all of it. First of all, I just want to go off topic for a second. Is anybody bored? No? If you were bored, I saw someone shake their head. You shook your head? Yeah. If you were bored, would you tell me? You would? All right. Well, in that case, I feel really good right now. Whew. Anyway, what was I talking about? Oh, yeah. Architecture. Sorry. Architecture. It's important, all right? And it's important not just because it gives the architect in your company an overpaid job. It's important because it allows you to reuse code. Oftentimes, your application logic is the same between your Android and your mobile app and your web app, all right? Certainly, not certainly, but especially things like how the app communicates with the server. In our example, for instance, we're using the same server APIs, right? The same API endpoints for our web and our mobile. Sometimes we have certain things that only relate to one. Sometimes we'll do an optimization for mobile. We'll bundle some data together. But basically, it's the same API. So all the code, that whole layer that talks to the server, I can reuse. right? If you're using Redux, for example. Redux, anybody? I feel like we're still in the phase where people are willing to raise their hand for Redux. Another couple of months, that'll be like raising your hand that you're a Java developer. And Redux, that's like enterprise. I use MobX. Yeah, I use Redux. And honestly, I really do. I like it, actually, believe it or not. And people have to say, can I reuse my Redux state? You can. If you kept your logic clean, if you kept it separate from the mobile side, you can reuse the same store. But you might not want to, because oftentimes your Redux store has a lot of stuff that's specific to not just the data flow, but also the user's flow. And oftentimes between mobile and the web, we have the same data, but we have different screens, or the screens are organized differently. And then, so maybe let's take the Trello example, where you might have 3 screens in mobile, you only have 1 screen on the web. Sometimes your Redux kind of breaks down, and you might decide that it's not really worth it. In our case, we use a lot of the smaller pieces across mobile and the web, libraries, things like that. But the higher level stuff like Redux, we typically just say it's faster to write our own separately. The challenge of reusing code between the web and mobile often becomes in compilation steps. The web team, they're like, we use Bower, or we use NPM, or we need a dist file like this, or whatever. They have their standards, their needs. And in mobile, we have very often opposite needs in React Native. I get very upset when somebody gives me compiled code. Really, it grinds my gears, because when I'm developing something and I need to drop down a layer to find it, I'm not talking about third-party code. I don't care. I'm never going to look inside Lodash's code. I assume it works, and if it doesn't, then screw it, right? But I'm talking about my own code. Because I want to share code with the web, the guys in the other room, I want to say, okay, some of our logic's the same, right? So let's pull it out and put it in this library. But then tomorrow, I'm going to have to go into that library to figure out what bug I created, or I need the border to be really smooth. I need to be able to be in my IDE and just click right into it. And so I don't want it to be compiled. I don't want the stuff in node modules to be compiled. And that's great in React Native, because the React Native packager likes that. It wants to do its own Babel. It's not interested in it gets actually annoyed often if there's a Babel RC inside somewhere in the node modules, and it'll break. And so sometimes the web people will make a change in order so that their thing can compile, and then suddenly our builds are broken. So we change it back, and then their builds are broken. This happens. You need to come up with some kind of process where you're going to write the same code. It's easy for you both to iterate on the code, but it also conforms to eventually running on completely separate platforms, a React Native, JSC, and a browser. Do create a separate module, though. Even though it creates this complication, don't be like that person who says, well, we can just work on the same code base, right? It'll become even worse. Because you need a separate module, first of all, for the separation of concerns. It enforces you to keep the code on this side of that module border generic. And second, it allows you to have build processes. Even though they're complicated, it allows you to do it. And if you had shared code, it would be even more of a mess. Which leads me to the final issue of NPM link. Everybody here know what NPM link is? Good. Nobody knows what NPM link is. You're lucky. Somebody knows what NPM link is. NPM link allows you to develop on a local version of a third-party library. In this case, the third party is actually yourself, right? Because you wrote the library and you're writing the application code. And you don't want to go open your IDE for the library, make a change, push it, let it build, then do npm install on your application, get the changes, check that everything worked. Oh, shoot, I forgot a semicolon, right? So you want to be able to work and see the results in real time. And so one option is to go into node modules and actually edit the code, but then you have to copy those changes back to your real repository, local copy of the repository, so you can push it. Another option is npm link, which says, no, just set up a symlink from the node modules to the real code on my machine. I'll edit the real code, and then when I run my application locally, it'll actually get my code, changes that are non-pushed. That's what npm link is. And it works pretty well, except in React Native. In React Native, it doesn't work at all. Because the React Native packager doesn't follow symlinks. So I had some luck when Yarn came out, and Yarn Link did a little bit of a better job. And I think there were some newer versions of React Native that supposedly fixed the problem. Maybe they really did fix the problem, but I don't know. I spend a lot of time like this, okay? Really. When it comes to, like, it'll work for 3 days and then it'll stop working, and I don't really know why. It has to do with, and nobody in my office does, we all fiddle around with it. Somebody found like, oh, if there's this file and then there's this thing and the symlink has to be configured like this, and then we like, oh yeah, you're right. So we do that for a couple of days, it works, and then it stops working. And I don't really know why, and I don't really have time to figure out why. I just deal with it. Why do I tell you all this, other than having an excuse to put this GIF on the screen? To understand that I think that you can get a lot of code reuse between the web and mobile, but if it's only going to be for 1 or 2 files, it's probably not worth it. It does cost a little bit. Sharing code with your web app, if you're using React Native, is a good benefit, but it's not free. It'll take energy, effort, and time from your other job, okay? But once you set up that process, you'll still deal with stress now and again, but if you have a lot of code, definitely possible and definitely worthwhile, and we do it, at least in our library code. What about multiple projects? Well, the situation here is even more hairy. And you guessed it, architecture matters. Binaries. You know, the whole idea of React Native, or not the whole idea, but one of the big ideas of React Native is to get away from these. Right? Or at least to pretend to the developer that they're not really developing a mobile app. So if I had to characterize the goal of React Native, I would say you give the developer experience of developing a web app, but you give the user the experience that they're using a native app. And the user is using a native app. The developer is developing a web app until the abstraction leaks and the developer has to do something that includes native code, and boom, now I need to open Xcode and dick around with those links, and nobody knows, I don't know. And never mind having to touch Gradle. You know what bothers me? Every time I open Android Studio, I have to wait. Is that just me? No, okay. Seriously? That feels like a bug in the process. And that's what React Native comes to solve. React Native attempts as much as possible that on your day-to-day bug fixes or changes, you shouldn't have to open Android Studio or Xcode. And that works until you start reusing some third-party code and it hits you in the face that you were lying to yourself. There is native code here. And the native code needs to be included in your project. So here's an example. I have some code. I wrote it. Everything works. And now I have another app. And I'm like, oh yeah, this is pretty similar. Same magic, I don't know, navigation bar. I'm going to reuse this. So I'm going to pull this out, put it in a library. I'll publish it. Everything will work, right? No, because if I put it in a library, anybody, especially if I'm an intermediate layer, let's say I'm not an app, I'm a library that's depending on this. Now anybody who relies on me needs to know what I'm depending on internally. I have to leak my internal dependencies, which is something you don't have to do on the web. If Lodash depends on leftpad, you have no idea until leftpad becomes unpublished. But if my React Native component depends on some guy's or girl's React Native component, everybody will know right away because they'll have to change their build process. They'll have to open up Xcode or Android Studio just to make it work again. It's a little bit of a bump in the process. And React Native also doesn't really like when there are multiple versions of certain libraries. You can't have in your app multiple versions of React Native, first of all. Second of all, you can't have multiple versions of other things. The React Native packager doesn't like it. It's not like Node, which, you know, again, React Native kind of fakes being like Node, but here and again, you realize, wait, in Node, you can have multiple versions of Lodash without a problem. You can have multiple versions of almost anything. I think anything. But in React Native, you can't. It expects certain things to be singletons. And so oftentimes, you'll be fighting with other people on your team because they changed something and now your thing is broken and who knows what. And that leads you to this situation, which is also fairly common. It was very common in the beginning of React Native because so many times there would be changes that nobody had any idea that they changed and you just have to update your app. And nowadays, it's gotten a little bit better. because things have stabilized. The React Native core team has slowed down their development process and fewer breaking changes. And the community that are developing libraries less frequently just change things that suddenly you have to change your app. But it happens. And finally, you have to ask yourself on all of these things if it's worthwhile. Reusing code between Android and iOS, pretty easy. Pretty easy. In fact, you have to try not to do it. And not just you have to try, you should try not to do it when appropriate. In other words, one of the pitfalls of React Native is that people reuse everything and then end up with an app that has a user experience that's subpar. Don't do that. Be smart. Understand that React Native can give you more than you need. It can allow you to make a bad app, but it doesn't force you to. If you choose, and you should choose, you can make a first-class experience by using native code when appropriate. When it comes to the web, you have to work a little bit harder. It's probably still worthwhile, especially if you have a full-fledged web app already. When it comes to reusing native code across React Native projects, it's more challenging. It still can be done. We do it, but we also have a team of 40 developers, some of which spend most of their time just writing open source components. If you're a small startup or 3-4 person team, it's probably not worth your energy to try that. But if you do, good on you. Bottom line of all of this. Anybody can guess? It's that architecture matters. It matters it matters all over the place. It matters in general. But it especially matters when you're thinking about code reuse. And by the way, this is not a new idea for React Native. This is an idea in general, right? If you want to reuse code in your Java app, then architecting your app properly is a good idea. But in the React Native world, for whatever reason, it seems like this is a not so well understood concept. Of course, people know not to copy paste code, right? But oftentimes people do, maybe because on the website in React, it's easy to do. Maybe in native code, I don't know. But for whatever reason, people often kind of bleed their logic together with their views. They mix things up. They don't keep things separate. They don't think from day one of, is this code going to be relevant somewhere else? Is this code going to be the same in the web? Even if I don't have a web app yet, but I will. Is this code going to be relevant for other apps? Is this code going to be relevant for both Android and iOS? Every time you write a line of code, or think about writing a line of code, think about those questions, and hopefully you'll have an app that works and gets the most code reuse out of it that you possibly can. Thank you. I'll take questions if you have any. Otherwise, I'll go drink a beer. Somebody has a question. I won't drink a beer. Did I talk fast? Because I talk fast. All right. Go ahead.
Have you ever tried building apps that need background processing or Bluetooth communication?
Bluetooth communication, no. Background processing, such as workers like background workers? No, I haven't personally, but it's not a. What's your concern, in other words? Why would React Native have anything to do with that, is my question.
I don't know, I was thinking maybe, is there any way to have reusable code for both Android and iOS?
Probably not. I'll tell you why. Typically what happens with React Native is this. Where your code deals directly with the hardware or other kinds of things, you're going to need native code. Okay? Maybe it's your own native code, maybe it's somebody else's native code that you're just going to include. And then what happens in React Native is you have some native code and then it gets wrapped in this little shell that gives the JavaScript world hooks and API to control it, right? That's all React Native is. Everything in React Native is that, okay? From top to bottom. The only difference is that a big chunk of that API was written already by Facebook. Another big chunk of it was written by open source world, right? And then some of it might be written by you. If there's going to be a Bluetooth connection, then there's going to have to be some native code involved, right? Now, if somebody, you might find that somebody will write some, an Android person will write some Android Bluetooth code, and an iOS person will write some iOS code, and then on top of that, they'll put a nice layer of JavaScript to give it a nice, clean, consistent API, which is really nice. Oftentimes that exists, or you can do that. We did that for navigation, for example, and a lot of other things. And then when you use it in your JavaScript code, you can use it as if it's the same thing. But at some layer, there's going to be native code. This is a strength and a downside. The downside is that there's no magic. The upside is there's no magic. The upside is that there's nothing that limits you, like, can you do a background process? Yes. But of course, the background process is going to be native code. It's always going to be. At the end of the day, everything is. But you can do it. There isn't anything you can't. I can't think of anything you can't do. Somebody else? Go ahead.
So for people like myself that have an Android and iOS app already, how possible is it to increment it?
Very possible. Facebook, it's one of Facebook's use cases. Facebook does that themselves. I haven't done it because we started our app with React Native from day one. But it's one of Facebook's use cases. Basically, you can start individual screens. The way it works is that React Native has root views, okay? You create a view that's the root of some React Native tree, some React tree. And then it communicates with native code across the bridge. So you can have multiple roots in a single application. You can have a single root. The typical starting point for a React Native app is a single root. But in some navigation solutions, it's not. And certainly if you have a brownfield app, then you'll go and you'll add independent pieces. Go ahead.
So 1 year ago, there was 4 computer science students at the Norwegian Science and Technology University, which graduated their master in computer science. And they were, instead of coming here with a fancy job, they decided to create a company. And so they chose to develop on Phaser.ai, which is HTML5 game development framework.
Okay.
And then they use Cocoon.io to support it to iOS and Android. And so basically they do everything in JavaScript and HTML5, and then there is the cross-platform and not having all these problems. And it looks beautiful and it works beautifully. And so I'm struggling myself with like the decision to go React Native or this option.
Good question. I don't make money I get paid for my job, but I don't make money if more people use React Native. So I'm not going to try to sell it to you. I'll tell you, first of all, I don't know Cocoon, okay? At the end, but I'm going to take a step back and talk about a little bit of all the different solutions out there, okay? So there's basically 3 approaches to getting an app out on an app store. Okay, one is you follow whatever the documentation for that given app store tells you to do. You use Java or Kotlin or Swift or Objective-C. You do it, you ship it, you're done. Okay, that's option A. Option B is you fake it. You make a web view, you write HTML, it's wonderful. You use something that gives you some level of API access to the hardware, some level. Possibly that level is close to 0, possibly it's close to 90, I don't know. There are many different solutions. But you're faking it, okay? And then option 3 is the option offered by React Native and a few others, which is we're going to write A, but we're going to ship B, okay? So we're going to write something that's not Java, Swift, whatever, but what's going to get to the user is going to be exactly what the device manufacturers want it to be, okay? That's the React Native approach. When you play with a React Native app, everything you touch or see is native. There are no web views. I mean, I guess you could wrap a web view as a native component and do it, but there's no point. React Native apps don't use web views. They're using true 100% native components, but those components are being compiled. They're being added to the app by JavaScript, Let's say it that way, okay? And there is JavaScript running in the app inside the runtime, calculating things, making decisions, doing business logic, okay? Your JavaScript code does run, but it doesn't create views. It just tells the native side which views to create. Now, you have to compare it to other solutions and make a decision for yourself. You know, it's not perfect, but is it good enough is really the question, right? I saw a talk at React Native EU about 2 or 3 weeks ago where one of the speakers said, you're never going to be able to make a React Native app that's as native as a native app, by definition. It can't, or that's more native than a native app. That can't be done. But you can make it asymptotically close. If you work hard enough, the user shouldn't be able to tell the difference. I don't know if you can do that with a web view. Maybe one day you could. Does that answer a question a little bit, anyway?
Please repeat the question.
The question, sorry. The question was about some other group that took a different approach of using HTML5 and then something called Cocoon that somehow magically, I don't know, I'm not familiar with it, somehow allows you to get an app on the App Store. And what I'm trying to address is broadly a couple of different approaches to how you can get an app on the App Store, either by doing the regular traditional native. You can not use a native app, you can do some kind of web trickery, or you can do some kind of web trickery that creates a native app. And you need to measure, each one of those has benefits and drawbacks. Anything else? Go ahead.
Can you tell a bit about navigation and mixed navigation library?
Yes, everybody's favorite topic, navigation. The question is, can I talk about navigation? Can I avoid talking about navigation? So navigation is a very touchy subject in the React Native community because it's one of the things that started as React Native came out with a couple of holes, or so to speak, unsettled questions. And one of the unsettled questions is, what should we use for navigation? Part of the reason I think this was an unsettled question is, as I understand it, Facebook isn't using any of the solutions that the community has, and they were not using the solution that they shipped with React Native because their apps are brownfield. So even when they use React Native, they have to integrate it with existing apps, so they're using whatever navigation is inside those apps. But when they shipped React Native about 2 years ago, they had something called the navigation, and then there was another component called navigation iOS. They shipped with two different components for navigation, and neither of them worked very well. And so at the time, there were a whole lot of open questions about what should be done. Wix, which is where I work, started a project. It was started by a fellow named Tal Cole. He started a project for, it's on GitHub, React Native navigation, which attempts to solve this problem in one particular way. Other people didn't like it. The main impedance mismatch here, I would say, broadly, is a philosophical question. Should the navigation solution be Reacty? Okay? How many people here are React developers? Okay, so only a few of you. React developers really like declarative code. That's the whole idea of React. I don't even know my own password anymore. Caps lock. Thank you. Sometimes I have the wrong language also. So, love you, Mac. So React developers want things, and people coming from the web often wanted things to be declarative, and you should just say like what state you're on, and then it would take care of all that stuff. And then Redux at the time was super into the whole hot reloading and time travel, and so you want to be able to time travel states, and navigation included. Okay, that's one approach. The other approach says, listen, you can't do that. You can't do it because the only proper way to build a native app is to use native navigation stack. Because each operating system does things, memory management, for example, does things that it has to know how your navigation works. Moreover, navigation is one of those things that creates the feel. It makes the app an iOS app or an Android app. And if you want your users to use an app that truly feels like a native app, you can't compromise in navigation. especially when Apple will probably change something in the next version, and then what are you going to do, right? So the Wix approach is based on sacrificing the webby feel of the desire for a webby sort of navigation for settling or living with a fully native navigation. Okay, it's implemented natively, and the API is a little bit a mismatch with the feel of. It's a pretty clean API, and they're working on a V2 that's going to be even better. But basically, you have this whole feel of a React app, and then there's like this navigation bottom layer that's not React-y. But when I show it to people, they say, wait, this is a React Native app? That's the benefit. There are other approaches, though, and I haven't done a whole lot of evaluating of them, so I don't want to talk about them. Airbnb tried something. I think they kind of froze what they were doing. From what I understand, they don't have the resources to continue it right now, but they had another approach. And then there's a very common or popular library called React Navigation, which is gaining popularity. It takes the other approach. The people at Wix feel strongly that sacrificing on navigation isn't acceptable. Especially the people with native backgrounds at Wix have very strong mind on this. They say the navigation's got to be fully native, and so it is. But it might be a little bit harder to work with. I don't know. Anything else? Running short on time?
Yes, I think so.
All right, no more questions. So I hope that I don't even know if there were more questions, but if there were, okay, ask on Slack or afterwards. So I'll take questions on Slack whenever, and I'll answer them. If you want everybody to hear the question, if you want to ask it in person, I'm game. Thank you very much.